Hi, my name is Stephen Holm.
And I'm Sharia. We've been attending Crossroads for the last year and a half.
And this is our story about how God has been faithful to us in the midst of grief.
Well, a year and a half into being married, we took that little plastic test and got two little pink lines, and it was so beautiful and joyful and scary. We were pregnant with our first child, and then 8.5 weeks later, after starting to tell family and friends selectively, I began to miscarry, laboring and delivering our first baby.
I remember feeling numb when we found out that we were beginning to miscarry, and I didn't know how to process that grief at the time. I just sat there in shock and just remember feeling like I didn't know the right way to feel at the time. I was like, am I supposed to be crying? Am I supposed to be curled up on the floor? But all I remember feeling was just an empty numbness.
We found ourselves oddly grateful for the losses that we'd been through before this event. I had been engaged before. It had been a very painful ending, and my husband had been through several different failures of church leadership, had experienced being singled out very negatively. And through those events, though separate before we ever met, we have seen God's faithfulness even when we couldn't see it, when we couldn't feel it, couldn't hear him. We clung to the fact that God is hope, and that God is healing, that he still has goodness in the land of the living for us. We went on to have two incredibly healthy pregnancies, so healthy that we found ourselves like glancing at that ultrasound going like, where's the abnormality? Aren't we supposed to have something go wrong? So we were just incredibly blessed. It was shortly after having our second daughter, I want to say probably 4 weeks afterwards. It was still in the height of postpartum emotions and taking care of your body and trying to figure out life again, that I found myself praying for a friend who was experiencing miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. She went on to have 6 concurrent losses. And so I remember praying probably around 2 or 3 a.m. that God would give me some form of giving me some tangibility to how I should walk out mourning with those who mourn, how I could come alongside her when I was in such a joyful season. And he gave me a vision, which was strange for me, coming from a very conservative, non-charismatic background. But I suddenly had this vision of all the footprints of her family up upon a canvas, and I knew I have to make this happen. This has to exist. So the business that we've started is named after the date of our loss, the July 27th miscarriage we experienced. And so my July 27 is a store, but it's also a story. It's our story. And it's a storytelling invitation. It's inviting people to share their own journeys through loss via artwork and via jewelry.
What I'd say to someone who is going through their own season of loss right now be look to Jesus. Remember how faithful he's been in the past to you. He's been faithful to me. He's been faithful to us. And just lean on that.
What a powerful story. Are they here? Okay, they were here first service. They threw me off. But I am just so thankful to Stephen and Sharia for their willingness to share. It's very raw. It's very vulnerable, but it can be very healing when we tell our stories of God's faithfulness to us. And just as God was faithful to Stephen and Sharia, which, by the way, when you see them in the weeks ahead, we asked them, we said, just so you know, you may have some folks who want to come hear more. You may have folks who want to come and share part of their story. Is that okay? And they said, absolutely. So we just say thank you to them, and we're going to be hearing more stories, but we're so grateful for God's faithfulness. That's at the root of what they shared, that he saw them through. And just as God was faithful with them, so too is he faithful with Nehemiah. That is where we have been so far in this sermon series. We've been unpacking this Old Testament story, looking at what it was like for Nehemiah to learn to sit in the tension between understanding God's faithfulness versus human faithfulness, learning to walk in faithfulness that blends the reality of earnest prayer and decisive action, which we talked about last week. We talked about how we can sometimes swing to one of those two things. We can be really decisive. We want to get stuff done. We don't want to sit around and wait. We really need to move this thing forward, so we don't care what we're going to plow through. We got to get this done. Or we have this tendency to freeze, waiting for God to give us a play-by-play of every single thing that we're going to encounter in life, because then maybe, just maybe, I would be willing to step out in faith. But see, both of those are all about control. And what we saw Nehemiah begin to unpack for us is that we're to live in the tension. We are to move forward decisively, confidently in what God has called us to do. And yet we are to have one ear to heaven, that we are to be earnest in prayer, that we are to be in communication with our Heavenly Father who wants to be in communication with us. And we are right in the thick of the story. I would encourage you, if you are new or are visiting with us, first of all, thank you. It takes a ton of courage to come into a place for the first time. But we would encourage you, if you've missed the last few weeks, go back online and watch the weeks 1 and weeks 2 of Faithfull, because we unpack pretty deeply the context of the story. We look at all the surrounding elements that happen in Nehemiah's life, what he's walking into, and I'm going to be jumping right into the thick of the story. And so if you're unfamiliar with who he is, if you're hearing this for the first time, that may be helpful for you to go back and watch online. Because it's important for us to know that just like Stephen and Sharia, Nehemiah is telling this story. It's written as a memoir, which means he breaks out into first-person comments and prayers. He is telling the story, and I think that helps ground it in reality. Sometimes we can read Bible stories, and it feels very out there. We just read names and places, and we're like, okay, that was a cool thing. But when we get to experience it, just like we experienced their story, we can remember, oh yes, this was a person who was learning, a person who was growing in their confidence of who God was, a person who was learning to walk by faith, a person who was learning to pray. And it's a journey. So what is it like for us to recognize the journey of prayer? And so before we dive in, I wanted to have one other person share with you, because I think it ties so well into what we're going to be talking about, the journey of prayer, to help us understand that it's a process. I've invited JV, if he'd be willing to come up here with us and share his journey of how God has taught him to be consistent and faithful in prayer. So JV, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So prayer, obviously I am the resident expert in this church, and that's why Beth came to me, because I know what I'm talking about. It started off when I was very young, and I would see the things in church, and I'd recognize, oh, that's how I pray. One of the first things I would see is people would pray with their eyes up to God. Okay, makes sense. The brains are upside in your head, and you're looking up to God. That works. Now, I also noticed that when people prayed, they'd also bow their head, and they'd close their eyes. And so the only reason that they would do that is because the prayers inside your head are going to fall out of your eyes, and they're going to go down to the devil. And the devil doesn't deserve our prayers. He should not have them. And so that's why we close our eyes. But I also noticed that if you close your eyes and they bounce back, sometimes people remove their hats before they pray. And that's very important, because if you keep your hat on while you pray looking down, it's going to hit the back of your eyelids, and then it's going to hit the back of the hat, and then it's going to stay in your head, and you're going to go crazy. So you need to remove your hat. And then that is the way that prayers are heard by God. So I know how I'm supposed to pray. Now I need to know what I'm praying. And obviously the Lord's Prayer is the first thing that my dad tells me. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. You just repeat that over and over and over again. And that is how you pray and what you pray. Now, as I got older, obviously that idea got challenged, especially when I would read and hear from my dad that I needed to pray without ceasing. And you can imagine how difficult it would be. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Or alternatively, you're going to bump into things. It's going to be a mess. You can't do that all the time. So what did it actually mean to pray without ceasing? The next step in that journey was understanding that God has a relationship with us. That it's not just me doing these acts and I'm not hearing God. I'm just saying I'm doing these things so that I can earn his love. That it was a relationship. In fact, in John 15, Jesus calls us friends because he let us know what the master was doing. So now we've become friends with Jesus. So how do I talk to my friends? I definitely don't just stare at them saying the same lines over and over again. Otherwise, I wouldn't have any friends. It's conversational. I look for advice. I come with struggles, with problems, with joys, with celebrations. There's a dynamic to it that we both feel like we're being heard and that we're seeing the world in a way that is similar to both of us. Even further than that, I would talk to my father. And my father would give advice as well. And that relationship was very similar. Although my dad's advice has always been much better than my friend's advice. Which, that's fine. Just need to have better friends, I suppose. Just kidding. But there was still this relational dynamic where we were talking and seeing the world together, togetherness. So as I fleshed out this idea of what prayer meant, I kept coming to this idea that it was an ongoing conversation with God. Much like our friends, much like our parents, or the people that are walking through life with us, we're doing it together. And it made me even think of the people that we work with. I've been working with Alex for a couple of years now. And in knowing how he works and how he functions, I'm able to kind of view the world through an Alex lens. Now, the Alex lens isn't perfect, but the Jeff lens isn't perfect either. But I can at least look at situations and say, yeah, Alex would do this. This is how Alex can be served. This is what Alex is trying to envision. I can kind of line those up. But when I would apply that to God, perfect, almighty, creator of the heavens and earth, God, what would it look like if I was able to begin to discern his will, to see the will and to see the world as God does through his lens and not my own? Because I know that I'm flawed. I'm going to make mistakes along the way. And even in seeing God's lens, I'm not going to be perfect. But I started to realize that prayer was that process of discerning God's will, to try and put ourselves, as impossible as that may seem, in his shoes to see things the way that God sees them so that I can act accordingly. And that's where I landed with prayer.
Awesome. Thanks, JV. That sounds pretty expert to me. Yes, thank you so much. I love that. I love the perspective of a child, because children, what they see is their reality. So that belief that the prayers are going to bounce off the back of my head and go up to heaven, and how we progress in that journey. Nehemiah progresses in that journey, and we see that ongoing dynamic of a man who's learning to be in relationship and connection to the Father, who prays long prayers, who prays short one-word prayers, who prays breath prayers, and who is able to walk into a situation knowing what God has called him to and knowing what it means to take God on the journey. So thanks, JV. And learning to try to understand from God's perspective is so crucial when it comes to viewing correctly the circumstances we find ourselves in. I'm going to say that again. Learning to see things from God's perspective. Now, we can't fully, as JV said, because we're not God, but learning to try to grow in that way allows us to see part of the bigger picture, to see there's more at play than the bleak circumstances we're in. Because sometimes those circumstances can feel really overwhelming, and sometimes they can pile up, and sometimes they can feel like they're unrelated and yet related at the same time. You know the phrase, when it rains, it pours? bad things come in threes, all these phrases we use to try to rationalize and justify the fact that we're going through really tough times. And so what happens when we find ourselves in these places? And I know that there are so many in this room who've been in similar seasons in their own journey. Nehemiah is in a similar place. He is getting hit from all sorts of different sides. He's come back to Jerusalem. So we're again at the beginning of chapter 5. He's come back to Jerusalem with the king's blessing. He's begun to rebuild the walls of the city under threat of attack. And he's also walking right into the midst of a famine that's going on within the community. So he's dealing with factors outside of the walls and inside of the walls. He's navigating people. He's holding on to what the king has asked him. He's dealing with sabotage. He is dealing with threats. He's dealing with natural disasters. He's dealing with a group of folks who are poor and hungry and the rich who are taking advantage. And all of these things are beginning to pile up. And can you feel the stress? And we find ourselves in similar places when it just seems too much. So what does he do? What can we learn? Well, that faithfulness in prayer is key. When we understand the dynamic of knowing someone that you can almost communicate without words, when we can do that, we can begin to understand in a spiritual sense the Father's heart, and we can carry that into the battle of life that we find ourselves in. And we are able to discern what's right from what's wrong. To discern from what's overwhelming and what's temptingly easy to what God is actually asking. If you want to hear this entire sermon summed up in one sentence so that you can take a nap, let me tell you what it is right now. Close proximity to the Father allows for a discerning spirit. Close proximity to the Father is what allows us to be able to determine what's right from what's wrong. And you might say to me, Beth, I've read my Bible. I know that discernment is actually one of the gifts of the Spirit, that there are those that God has given the special ability to discern too. That's not for everyone. And you're right. You're right that God has enabled certain people with discernment, that they can walk into a space and read it almost immediately and know the threat. But discernment is actually something we are all given, because discernment comes as relational connection with a Father deepens. We don't get an out. As believers in Christ, we are called to have our eyes open and our ears open to what's going on, to stay close to the Father while moving forward so that we can walk out his kingdom work. We can be part of his plan. And we can handle the threats that come our way. Nehemiah hits 3 in these 3 chapters. And I don't have time in these last 15 minutes to dive too deeply into the nuances of each individual verse and section. I'm going to tell the story very similarly to how Nehemiah may have told it. But I encourage you, go back, read it, spend time in it, study it. We've talked about the context. You are empowered and equipped to read this passage. I'm just going to reference a few things because Nehemiah encounters 3 attacks in which discernment is key to help him see it through. Because again, like we said, he's not only building a wall to help fortify the city, he's also dealing with all sorts of other things. And at the beginning of chapter 5, we encounter Nehemiah dealing with a situation between the rich and the poor in the community. Within the community of believers, within the Jewish community, what we see is that people are taking advantage of one another. Now, because of the famine, because of forgetting the Old Testament law, because God actually did a really good job, turns out he's God, of putting something in place to help people love and care for one another well. Whether it was them forgetting that, the famine, all these different factors, what we're starting to see is that the poor are having to sell their land, they're having to sell their homes, they're even having to sell their children. And in chapter 5, we hear the men and the women begin to complain that they're having to sell their daughter's own kin and relationship. And we're seeing the rich Jewish people beginning to take advantage. They're beginning to charge interest. They're beginning to really push the poor poorer. And Nehemiah encounters this. And what does he do? Well, I love what he does. We're going to read that part of it in chapter 6. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. And I pondered them in my mind. And then accused the nobles and the officials. I was very angry, justifiably so. The injustices of this world should make us angry. We have a lot that we need to fight for, and we see this sense of him getting really angry. But what does he do? He doesn't snap. He doesn't lash out. He doesn't allow his emotions to control him. Because he has stayed in close proximity to the Father, what does he do? He stops and he ponders. And then he responds. We talk a lot at Crossroads about emotions and why emotions are important. It is not wrong to feel emotions. Emotions inform a lot of what's going on inside of us. What is wrong is when those emotions become our idols, when those emotions are allowed to drive our actions, when we're so consumed with what is going on internally within us that we will lash out at anyone who is in close proximity to us. And when we do that, we burn bridges. When we do that, we push people away. When we do that, we serve only ourselves. And so what Nehemiah does by stopping and pondering is he actually allows for God to work. He actually is able to come at it with a measured anger, which allows people to be receptive. The original language says he took counsel with himself, which means, as we translate that, to consider carefully within one's own heart with response following. So response does come, but it comes after considering, after weighing, after seeing what's really going on. And that consideration makes what comes next not selfish, not out of a self-serving ambition, but he's able to actually expose the cracks of the community, not to cover them up, but so that they can heal. And he calls them out. In verse 9, so I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of the Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let the exacting of interest stop. Give back. Give back. And what do? Because his response is measured, they give back. And they make a vow right then not to continue to do. I love that. Nehemiah is so clever. He doesn't give them a chance to walk away and change their minds. He makes them make a vow right there that they will take care and honor those in the community that need help. What a beautiful example of good leadership. To be able to not react in anger, but to stop and to discern. And then he makes a defense for himself. The rest of chapter 6 is him going on to explain the things that he's doing to model what it's like to care for those in the community. This is the first encounter. We're into chapter 5, We're into chapter 5, and this is the first encounter that we hear as readers of him actually not only being sent by the king, he's actually been made governor. So he hasn't used his power and authority to gain. He's just now saying, as governor, I have modeled what this looks like. He gives this defense for himself of how he has cared for folks, how he's invited people into his table to eat. And it would be really easy to read this and think, well, he's just bragging now. He's just talking all about how good he is and how amazing he is. But he's giving a defense for the measured response that he gives. So the question is it self-serving when we're required to make a defense for ourselves? I just recently encountered a story where I was sitting in a meeting, and it was a bunch of people who had come to a table to discuss something. And as we were discussing, one of the people speaks up, and they said, well, I'm speaking on behalf of everyone. And she begins to tell her side of the story. And I thought, whoa. Like, I don't disagree with some of the stuff she's saying, but I wasn't involved in those conversations. And actually, I need to be careful. I have to speak up, because if I don't speak up, that could impact what's going on in my world, in my sphere, in the ministry that God has called me to. It wasn't about making myself look good, although that temptation was there, and I had to check it. I had to check, God, is this about making me look good? Or is it about understanding that when we make a defense for ourselves that protects the gospel and the God that we serve, we are actually continuing to allow the kingdom to move forward? We see Paul do the same thing in the New Testament, where he makes the defense for himself. He talks about all the things that he does, and he's doing it not to gloat or brag, but he's doing it so that God may get the glory, so that the misinformation and misinterpretation of the gospel can be stopped and can be handled appropriately, so that God may ultimately get the glory in the situation. I love that. Whenever something threatens to undermine the work of the kingdom, we have a chance to stop and discern. Do I speak up? What are you asking me to do? I love this quote. It's just so good, I'm probably going to read it twice, just so you know, because this is an internal conflict. This is a conflict within the community of Jewish believers. This quote says this: if Satan can bring distress and division from within, the cohesiveness of the community will be torn apart, and its effectiveness to function as a unit will be destroyed. If Satan can bring distress and division from within, the cohesiveness of the community will be torn apart, and the effectiveness to function as a unit will be destroyed. Nehemiah had a responsibility. We have a responsibility to not allow the enemy to cause division and divisiveness within the body of Christ. And that if someone angers us, if someone makes us upset, we stop and we discern, God, what's really going on? God, is this me? And then to have a measured response per Matthew 18, to take it to that brother or sister and to talk it out. There's too much at stake with what is going on here. We have a part to play in his kingdom story, and the enemy would love nothing more than to tear it down. We have a message of hope, of healing that the world needs to hear, so we cannot be another story of division tearing the church apart. Nehemiah models that for us, and we have to hold true to that sense that there is something worth protecting. So he handles, through discernment, the threats from within, and he handles them from without. Chapter 6, the same threats that we see in chapter 2 have come back. The same people who are angry, other leaders outside of Jerusalem who are all part of the Persian Empire, but who are there on the borders, who are angry and upset because Jerusalem is beginning to get into a place where it can protect itself. They don't like it. So they come back. They're still scared. And so they begin to send messengers into Jerusalem to Nehemiah that says, come, meet us in the plain of Ono. You're welcome for that, a random piece of information. But the plain of Ono is about 35 miles outside of Jerusalem. It's in the northern Shephelah, which means that it is outside, at this time, within the Persian Empire, it is outside the bounds of provincial safety for Nehemiah. They're trying to draw him out. They're trying to make him vulnerable and the city vulnerable. Under the feigned guise of friendship, let's meet, let's talk. And every time he recognizes it for what it is, he doesn't allow the temptation to go and meet them, to distract from the vision. When God calls us to do something, there are so many other things that can seek to distract us, so many other things that can make our name look good, but we have to stay true to what God has asked us to do. And he says 4 times, he sends back and says, nope, this work is too important. I'm staying here. The 5th time, they get so angry that they actually write an unsealed letter, AKA so everyone can read it. And they send this unsealed letter with a messenger, basically accusing Nehemiah of trying to usurp the king's authority, to try to build an army, to try to build up his walls so that he can take over and be king. To which Nehemiah could have been so tempted to want to protect his name, that he could have fought back, that he could have gone and met them, that he could have pushed. But what does he do? This is probably one of my favorite parts in this whole thing. Chapter 6, verse 9, when they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed. I stopped and I prayed. Now strengthen my hands. And I've been trying to figure out why I love this prayer so much. It's so simple. We see him pray long prayers, short prayers. This one's so simple. Father, strengthen my hands. Not smite my enemy. Not protect my name and make sure my name looks good. Strengthen my hands. Strengthen my resolve. Make me physically strong to handle the burdens of this call. Strengthen my ability to not be overcome by my weaknesses. Strengthen my hands. I love that when the temptations get strong, when it's easy for us to want to fight for all the wrong reasons, when we really want to look good in the eyes of our enemies and our friends and peers, when it's so easy to fall prey to all these things, to stop and to pray, Father, strengthen my hands for the work ahead so that you may get the glory. That discernment to know what even to pray when this feigned friendship comes along, this attack from without. And then finally in chapter 6, there's one more story we come across. And I have to be honest, this one scares me more than the first two. Because all three of them are attacks. All three of them are threats. All three of them are things that Nehemiah had to deal with while still trying to build the wall, by the way. This third threat scares me the most because it's from both, inside and outside. It's a conspiracy, a priest who was hired from the outside to tempt Nehemiah into the temple, to tempt him to get away and to flee. We read, as he says in verse 10, let's meet in the house of God inside the temple. Let us close the temple doors because men are coming to kill you by night. They are coming to kill you. He tries to lure him into the temple because Old Testament law says that civil authority, we now know that he's the governor, civil authority is not allowed within the temple. And that if a civil authority goes into the temple, the priests have the right to kill them, or they have the right to discredit their name. In fact, King Uzzah in 2 Chronicles is lucky enough when he goes into the temple only to walk away with leprosy. It's a big deal. It's a law that was upheld. And so he's trying to draw him in. He's trying to make him lay down the culture and the law and the God that he serves in order to protect himself. And he's doing it as a subtle attempt between inside and outside to draw him away from the battle, the front lines, to make him give up what he believes and knows is right in order to protect his own safety. And that scares me to death. Because that same attack, that same sense of the world trying to sneak in to the church, trying to feign protection if we will just give up everything we know to be right, everything we know the word says about who God is and what he's doing, that is real and it is alive, and we have to be on our guard. That there is an attack that comes, an attack that attacks us internally, because how tempting for Nehemiah just to want to run away because the work is hard. But he doesn't. He recognizes it. He holds true. In verse 13, he says, he's been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this. And then they would give my name a bad name to discredit me. In all of these circumstances, it's Nehemiah's discernment because of his close proximity to the Father that allows him to recognize the threat. And we have those same threats. We have threats from within. We have threats from without. We have threats from both. We have threats that are internal. And we, as God's people, have a responsibility, a stewardship to learn to be in close proximity to the Father so that we can discern what is right from wrong, that we can discern what is good from what is God. to have eyes to see, because we have a part to play in this story. We have something worth giving and something worth protecting. And out of Nehemiah's discernment, his prayer, and his action, it led to the wall being built in 52 days. So he navigates all of that while building the wall, and he is able to do it because he has stayed true to his vision, because he's a man of high character, and because he's learned to listen to the Father so that he can discern. And we are invited into that. Friends, I said it last week. I will say it again. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, if you claim Jesus as Lord and Savior, you are a leader. Sorry. You are a leader in your home. You are a leader with your friends. You are a leader in your community, in your workplace, wherever you find yourself. If Jesus is Lord, you are a leader. And you have the same Spirit at work inside of you that can enable you, as you stay in close proximity to the Father, to discern what's right from wrong, to know when to take a stand, to know when to respond in measured anger, and when to pray, when to fall to your knees, and when to give him glory. Because at the end of this, at the end of chapter 6, when the wall is built, he recognizes where his help really came from. And where our help really comes from, friends, is not our strength, not our ability, but his. And so we're invited into that journey. And it's very sobering to think about the need of having discernment, but it's also very honoring to know that we can have that gift as well. And so in closing, I want to pray something very simple. I love what we've been learning from Nehemiah. I love what's going to come in the days ahead, but I want to pray this. Will you close your eyes with me? Father, strengthen our hands. Strengthen our hands for the task ahead. May God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And as we scatter out into the community until we gather again, may he turn his face towards you and give you his peace. And all God's people said, amen. We have a part to play. That's exciting. And I'm so thankful that we get to do it together. God bless you. Have a good week, and we'll see you again soon.